Hello, my name is John Woodshaw, and welcome to the first in a series describing the 7 generations existing today. This follows my previous series, Science, Metaphysics, and a Computer Simulation. More and more scientists have convincing evidence and conclude that our reality is a simulation similar to games played out in a computer. In support, I presented a theory how it is possible to have billions of avatars that the players can choose. A new scientific paradigm in physics offers a far superior theory regarding construction of the universe based on electricity than just gravity. It is possible then that planets in the solar system with varying charges would have influences on the sun via sunspots, along with personalities of the avatars and how they would be further influenced throughout time. In the former sessions, the concepts of how scripts which follows the seasons where a variable, say fire, is allowed to expand and then contract just like in the seasons. A firing order of the astrological signs provided such a script. I showed the 12 scripts that make up predictable human behavior. The players are complicated beings. It is unlikely that they will just play one script. There are 12 hats that they can wear. A woman may be beauty in her personal relationships, but Leo in her career scene, while being the beast with her children and father to her friends. Moreover, they all play out at different time rates, and their position in these cycles will all be different. The ascendant is often a major script, while the planets will modify it in its unique ways. As I mentioned throughout, planetary positions and aspects are a key in any analysis of a script. Of course, the placement of the sun is a major factor in any analysis. In many cases, it may define a major script. If the sun is in the 12th house, it would indicate an individual that feels like he lives in a closet for a period of time before the light shines on the illusions created by the rising sign. The placement of the moon indicates past conditioning or an addiction which is affecting this life. The moon's position may represent the yin portion of a script so as to bring balance to the solar or yang portion. In analyzing the lunar position, we need to ask the question, what is the moon's position in relation to the solar cycle? And how does it affect? The slower moving planets move at a very slow speed, such that they affect a whole generation, making it possible to analyze different generations. The orbit of Neptune is relatively steady at about 14 years, going through a sign. Now Pluto has an elliptic orbit relative to the other planets, meaning that its speed changes within its orbit. Around the 40s, Pluto was within Neptune's orbit, and for several years they traveled as a pair, both proceeding through a sign taking 14 years. At that time, when this happened, they were approximately 60 degrees apart, a sextile aspect, division by 6. Now recall, each script has a yang and a yin synthesis, which are sextile or 60-degree aspects. What this means is everyone born since 1940 till recently has a sextile or a 60-degree aspect between Neptune and Pluto, and they will travel in concert. Fortunately, they both enter into new signs at the same time, making it possible to distinguish generations based on these signs. What makes it even more interesting is that Uranus moves 7 years in a sign, meaning that it will move 2 signs, while Pluto and Neptune move 1. And this will define the energies for that generation. Finally, Saturn will move to its opposite in that time. For our analysis, we will use the Uranus cycle starting when it went into Aries in 1927, and then into Taurus 7 years later. while Pluto was in Cancer and Neptune in Virgo. We'll label this generation number 1. These are the depression babies that lived through these years. In this analysis, we'll be examining what happened during the time period and how it affected generations that were the players. We will also examine the planetary energies affecting the children born at this time. Pluto was born during this time. Did Pluto usher in the end times? Many would say yes. There is very little similarity between then and now. What will be described are the collective consciousness for that particular period. Again, the 3 other planets are transpersonal, meaning that the 3 are quantized regarding the placement in the sign. Aspects between them would be independent of their degrees within the planet's degree, of course, is important when other planets aspect it. Then the other planets will have a direct bearing on the individual personality. These planetary positions would describe both the generation that makes the times along with the children that is affected by the times. My choice for generations and their times does not match what is accepted by mainstream. As described in my series, Science, Metaphysics, and a Computer Simulation, Saturn is the key figure defining change in human development. 7 years marks the end of being the center of the universe, while 14 years of age marks the end of being a satellite to a solar sun, which marks the end of parenthood. 14 years of age is the time where the child joins the collective, expanding their choices through relationships. It is possible to become a parent to a new generation during these times. The teen years are given a blast of Venus, which intensifies all interactions, either positively or negatively. Parents are no longer gods, replaced by consenting peers. This is dangerous because something outside of self has such an influence on these players. Thus, whatever Venus energies prevail in the next generation will be bombarding these teenagers and have a great influence. One final note, there is a lot of slop during these cusp years. Recall, these planets spend a lot of time retrograde, so they may not be going into new signs at the same time. Since 1927 ushered in great changes in events, I am marketing all the older generations as the World War II generation. Generation number 1, the Depression babies, 1927 through 1941. During these times, Pluto was born, 1931, in the sign of Cancer and was square to Uranus in Aries. This generation is marked by this square and as such starts with the yin portion and brings in the yang later, if ever. This is the time after the castration of Uranus, or the yang portion of this script. The generation started at the height of the masculine might, where the world was bullish and everyone was going to become rich. 2 years later was the Great Depression that lasted up to the Second World War and into the next generation. President Roosevelt made the statement that epitomizes this generation. There is nothing to fear but fear itself. Fear was everywhere after the economy collapsed throughout the world. Fear makes individuals feel helpless against collective force. Such fear makes people willing to sacrifice their individual liberty to join some ism, so as to create a force that ensures some security, the collective. People were flocking to fascism on one extreme and communism on the other. People needed a cause which later determines which side they would be in the Great War coming up. The dynamics of this script mirrors the yin portion of the Aries script. Uranus in Aries was awakening the world to a new masculinity. No longer was manifest destiny the mantra for the masculine and the spirit since the birth of the United States. Recall, whenever Parsifal was placed in need, his thoughts always went to Mother. She ruled through guilt. Pluto kidnapped the control over fire, allowing the emergence of irresponsible entities, giving it free range to manifest in the world. This ego state will go to the max and become its opposite, from one extreme to the opposite. This will manifest in the generations, where the visible generation plays out while their children will play the opposite. In this case, the World War II generation will play out what is happening, while the Depression babies will become their opposites. It is the nature of the adolescent to become the opposite of their parents. It is this way that generations evolve. It is really hard to conceive being in a depression from 1921 up to the war and then having to endure hardships until its end in 1945. Being out of work is deadly. The male archetype took a hit when they can no longer provide. They were castrated. People had to learn to live without money, leading to great losses of freedom. The previous generation, the World War II generation, grew up in the roaring 20s when it was a great time to be male. The American dream was real. If you worked hard, you could own your own home. The status improved for women also. They were allowed to vote. Because of Prohibition, mobs and violence were created. Outlaws were everywhere, with speakeasies becoming mainstream. There was a freedom that wouldn't be repeated until the 60s. This all ended in 1929 and the start of the next generation. These times started with a crash, and everyone had to harden up. As mentioned, all kinds of isms popped up where people gave up personal freedoms to join something that afforded a better life. The leaders that will be the actors in the Great War was making their moves into power. The menace of fascism and communism brought even more fear during these times. The World War II generation made the ultimate sacrifice by having to endure war for so many years and the staggering number that were killed, mostly from this generation. They had a brief reprieve before they had to endure the Cold War against the forces of communism. When the Great Split that divided the U.S. in the Vietnam War occurred, they were the patriots, the users, us against, and the good guys. They were the Archie Bunkers, the conservatives, while the Flower Child was their adversary. Where were the Depression babies? Depression babies were spared the Great War. Theirs was the forgotten war, Korea. World War II was the last good fight. Lines were cleanly drawn. England and her allies were the good guys, while the Axis was really bad. When communism became a worldwide menace, taking over country after country, things really got scary when China went red. The Iron Curtain was circling the globe. The Korea War sucked the blood out of the Depression babies, but for the first time, the forces of fire didn't win. It was a draw. The Army had so many restrictions, making it impossible to win without us threatening to a bigger war. The Depression babies weren't the heroes like the previous generation. The 50s was the witch hunt, as the communism menace was everywhere and people were condemned for joining an ism during the Depression. The bright U.S. good guy image, Uncle Sam, etc., started to become tainted when they were breaking laws for a greater good, as they claimed. It really became tainted during the 60s and the Vietnam War. Again, where did the Depression babies stand on these issues? They were split. Many went traditional and sided with the older generation and became the Archie Bunkers, and the rest joined the movement, the hippies, the anti-establishment. The Depression babies are lost in time generation. Their music, culture, everything was pretty much forgotten in time. They were teenagers in the 50s, the do-nothing years. They were rebels without a cause, the male hero that couldn't express himself. There were very few world leaders, and none became presidents. Their biggest contribution was softening the role of Saturn. They instituted the parent that wanted to be friends with their child. Of course, in many cases, it went too far. It started a trend where children became the rulers of the home. Uranus in Aries was awakening a sensitive side to males. It was very confusing, leading to an inner rebel. It took the next generation to bring out that rebel. The important square to Pluto in Cancer is the energy which brought on the Yin cycle in the Parsifal myth. The Yin side features a need for security that resides in the loss of self-esteem and a lot of guilt. The Depression babies were born to mirror this role of self-esteem loss and a lot of fear and guilt. It took great courage to take the risk. Neptune in the sign of Virgo and is the synthesis of the Yin cycle, which deals with guilt. They feel guilty for the actions of the masculine. They paved the way for them to become choiceless between masculine and aggression, or femininity and peace and negotiation. This generation was sandwiched between two powerful generations and was largely forgotten. Neptune deals with illusions that are needed to whitewash reality. It comes whenever we pedestalize something. It can go both ways. The cycle taking 14 years is either positive or negative and going to its opposite. For the Depression babies, they inherited a lot of guilt so they can learn to forgive themselves and forgive masculinity. In 1934, Uranus went into Taurus, giving relief from the square to Pluto and turning it into a sextile, and it was trine to Neptune. This all harmonizes with the Yang portion of the Taurus script. In essence, it means becoming an object of desire so as to attain security. It is the positive blurring of Venus and the Moon. The Great Depression had become a way of life. The New Deal gave hope to the downtrodden, while the various isms flourished. While the world enjoyed prosperity in the 20s, Germany suffered terribly due to the greed of the victors in World War I. That changed when Hitler came to power, bringing prosperity and hope to the people. This was achieved with slave labor. The Depression babies born during this aspect would provide more compassion and restore a sense of idealism into the world. After the near worldwide devastation of World War II, this generation born benefited and were inspired by an imperative for human beings to look after each other on wider levels. Again, this influence would soften the role of Saturn, or the father's role in the family. In 1940, there was a triple conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus. The former two kicked off a 20-year cycle of expansion-contraction, as described previously. This decade would be the expansion, fire in this case. Uranus added to the mix would indicate the start of a 40-year-plus cycle. There would be a new cycle between Uranus that breaks Saturn's barriers and the latter in sealing them up. This all takes place in the sign of Taurus. Taurus deals with objects of desire. Recall, Uranus brings on event horizons and 1-0, all or nothing. However, it's only a flash and quickly closes when Saturn seals the opening. The length of time open is subject to individual karma. However, during these times, the number 2 hard drive on the master computer was open, allowing many players entrance to information. The aim of this cycle is to enjoy possessions without becoming addicted to them. What timing? For 12 years, people had to live without any. And now new consciousness was available regarding the possible addictions to possessions and the energy of Venus. Again, this generation script describes the collective unconscious during this period. As in all the generations that will be described, this collective personality forms the archetype which offers a pull on the master commander of each player to make choices in compliance with this script. Of course, many players did not made new choices in defiance to this archetype. This is true for all the 7 generational scripts. This generation featured the Yin portion of the Aries 1 script and the Yang portion of the Taurus 2 script. You can review these scripts in Science, Metaphysics, and Computer Simulations numbers 7 and 8. In conclusion, this forgotten generation features a castration of the forces of fire, leading to a softening of Saturn and the Father. The absence of fire brings in the energy from the feminine as expressed in the harmony of the Moon and Venus. In the next session, Generation 2 will be discussed. The World War II generation will be the major players during this war and in following years. Generation 1 will be the teenagers, while this new generation will have these energies in their birth chart. Please subscribe and tell your friends. Until then, be happy.